Good evening, everybody. I want to thank Political Connections and their partners for hosting this event. After Professor Sheikh and the representative of ACLU, I don't know what else can I add to the discussion. I remember that before 9/11, American Muslims struggled to get the US government to hear their voice. We used to write articles and rewrite articles and try to invite representatives of the US government to come and listen to our viewpoints on policy, etc. Very little success. After 9/11, it seems that the US government cannot stop listening to us at all. It listens to every word we say, it reads every word we write, and it also reads every word we read. The United States and the Muslim world, I think, jointly experienced 9/11. A lot of people think of 9/11 as a tragedy for Americans alone. It is not. 9/11 was a tragedy for not only the United States, but also for the Muslim world in many, many ways. As a result of 9/11 directly, America today is diminished. America is a diminished power. It cannot even have a military impact on Syria anymore. The president was absolutely delighted that he found a little bylane by which he would escape making an intervention in Syria. America is now an economically diminished power. Our economy has structurally adjusted to significantly lower levels before 9/11. And we are talking about the new normal. Young Americans are looking at unemployment rates hovering around 20%. And America's competitiveness has also diminished vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But most importantly, we also live in a diminished democracy. It is absolutely fascinating to me that both the United States and the Muslim world in the post-9/11 era have done more to destroy themselves than to make themselves safer. The United States' idea of responding to 9/11 was passing the Patriot Act. And you've heard much about it, so I will not delve. But what it really does is significant. In 2001, the United States was, as it is even today, the world's military superpower. The US has never had so much monopoly on power as it had in 2000. In that year, no challenge from the Soviet Union. The economy was booming under Bill Clinton. It was a moment of supreme power. In that supreme moment, we felt so insecure that we thought that the values by which we had lived for nearly 200 years, we couldn't afford them anymore. And so we effectively suspended the Bill of Rights through what we call the Patriot Act. So our act of patriotism was to essentially diminish the power of our own Constitution. America's elected officials swear to protect the Constitution, but what they did was to diminish it. And then we proceeded to pursue a response to September 11, which continues even today in the same way, but without having any of the positive benefits that we had hoped for. We waged an illegal war in Iraq, which destroyed that country, but also destroyed America's economy. The levels of anti-Americanism that was witnessed globally in the years from 2004 to 2008 till Obama was elected were unprecedented in America's history. Americans who were traveling in Europe were wearing t-shirts saying, "I'm a Canadian." And it was half in jest. But the animosity was so palpable that Americans went overseas were forced to defend the policies of the Bush and Cheney administration, which we couldn't. Candidates were running for elections in South Korea and in Pakistan and in Germany, for many of them, anti-Americanism was their greatest virtue. People were winning elections all over the world by choosing an anti-American platform. Who in the right minds would think that policies which engender anti-Americanism to this extent are good policies to make America safe? But there have been consequences to those policies also. The direct consequence of America's war in Iraq are manifold, and I'm not sure whether we have learned all the lessons that Iraq has taught us. The first lesson that we should learn from Iraq, just today, about 96 people were killed in suicide bombings of sectarian nature in Iraq today. The most important lesson that Iraq teaches us is that perhaps military power is not sufficient anymore to achieve political goals. That it is, we just can't bully our way to the political outcomes that we desire. That is perhaps the most powerful lesson that we learn from Iraq. The second thing that we also learn from Iraq is that the United States cannot afford now to be a major military power, asserting its power across the world. The third thing that we learn from Iraq is the limits of America's diplomatic power. We started talking about the coalition of the willing, which really means the coalition of the bullied. So we had lost international legitimacy, and our foreign policy was now being pursued with the help of those whom we could coerce into following us, rather than having international institutions and international norms backing us. The abandonment of multilateralism in the wake of the war in Iraq also exposed the United States as an empire. Until then, the United States was hiding behind the veil of multilateralism. And the fact that the US could not muster the international support necessary to justify the war in Iraq and yet pursue it. Under the same principle, the preemptive war is the same idea as preemptive policing. This is preemptive policing in the international level. So the United States push to pursue unilateral wars if it deemed necessary in its national interest, essentially exposed the US for what it had tried to conceal for more than 50 years, that it was an empire. And unlike the empires of the past, it was much more subtle. It used international law, international institutions, and processes like multilateralism to hide the fact that it was an empire and yet pursue imperial goals quite blatantly, often in the past, but now in the post-9/11 era, in a fashion that is both naked and brutal. And unfortunately, even after the election of President Obama, which in itself is one of the few positive things that I see happening in the United States after September 11. And the fact that we have elected a black president. I don't know why we define him black, because he's half black and half white. Calling him a white president should just be as accurate as calling him a black president. But nevertheless, electing him was something very positive. Then re-electing him was also very positive. But nevertheless, the fact that President Obama is the one under whose supervision the drone attacks have become what they are, in the sense that in the number of civilians killed, we are nearly on par with the Taliban in Pakistan. So in terms of, it's like one day the Taliban are ahead, and the next day we catch up with them in the number of civilians who are being killed in Pakistan. That is our foreign policy in Pakistan these days. And that this happened under the supervision of a liberal president who has already won the Nobel Prize for Peace. I mean, it was Obama's promise of peace that earned him the Nobel Prize, isn't it? But it's not just the attacks in Pakistan, but also this national security eavesdropping program which is so global in its nature. Spying on our enemies, spying on our friends, eliminating the distinction between friends and enemies on the international scale and at the domestic level. All of these are signs of an empire that is increasingly unwilling to even have any pretext of multilateralism or consideration for interests of the other. But what about the Muslim world? The Muslim world has gone through many emotional roller coasters since September 11. They went from denial to despair, from hope to now despair again. Today alone, 96 people were killed in Iraq through suicide bombings all over. In Pakistan, 60 Christians were killed in a massive attack. And I don't know, I've been driving for several hours, but when I last heard the news, the number of dead in Nairobi had reached 59. And the hostages, the terrorists still had 30 or 40 hostages under their control. I don't know what has happened in Nairobi since. This is 3 9/11s happening in the Muslim world. The Muslim world has been experiencing a 9/11 every other week. And what happened in Iraq, what's happening in Syria, what has happened in Pakistan are profoundly far more devastating. The violence, the loss of life, the destruction of property, and the destruction of trust and social harmony in these countries has been so profound and so deep that it might take decades for many of these countries to recover. Early Muslim response to September 11 was of denial. Especially American Muslims could not believe that Muslims could do what happened on September 11. And then, when they saw the violence in Iraq after the war in Iraq, and the suicide bombings and other attacks that continued in Pakistan and other places, Muslim world has been forced to acknowledge that there is a problem of extremism, a problem of intolerance, and a problem of preference for violence as a means to all problems. Apparently, violence is the instrument of choice in the Muslim world to settle disputes and any and all kinds of problems. And now, with events like those which we are witnessing today, a vast majority of Muslims everywhere are in a state of despair. They know that there is extremism. They even understand what the causes of those extremism are. Part of them are domestic and cultural, and part of them are as a result of the global order and the injustices that Muslims rightly or wrongly perceive taking place in the international system against Muslim peoples, like in Palestine, and against Muslim countries. But they also feel helpless and unable to fix these problems. They feel helpless and unable to fix these problems. And increasingly, I sometimes do radio shows over Pakistan which involve question and answer sessions from people from areas which are affected by extremism. And there are ordinary people who call in and ask me, so what can we do? And I find it increasingly that in the last 2 years I have no answer. Because every answer that I gave in the past has failed. I really, the Muslim world is at a loss as to how to combat this extremism, which is exacerbated by its previous events and the responses that Muslims are encountering from the rest of the world as a result of their own crimes. 2011 was a very important year for much of the Arab world. The Arab Spring, what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt, was transformative. I actually looked at the opportunity of Al-Qaeda saying what has happened in Tahrir Square in January 2011 has clearly shown that the Muslim masses can now enable and precipitate transformative politics peacefully. Civil institutions will emerge, democracies will emerge, and conflicts will be resolved through democratic means. Muslims will not need institutions like Hizbullah, Qaeda, etc., whose appeal will quickly diminish because now there are democratic avenues for change available to Muslims. But even those hopes prove to be temporary. After what has happened in Egypt in the last couple of months, and the Arab Spring, which started so spectacularly in Tunisia, is now dying so spectacularly in Syria. And literally going out with a bang, so to speak. Already over 120,000 people have died in Syria. And there is promise of more to die in the next few years. So the temporary hope of democracy, which Muslims have perceived, who could transform the Arab world at least, is now dead too. And there are commentators who believe that the events of Egypt may have killed the promise and hope of democracy all over the Muslim world, perhaps for this entire generation. Is there anything positive that has come about? Well, in the first few years after September 11, one of the positive things that we used to see around was events like these. I cannot tell you how many of these I have done in the last 12 years. Probably in the first few years, more than a couple of hundred a year. Dialogues in churches, in synagogues, in temples, in mosques, in universities. Sometimes I've spoken in events in Texas where there have been thousands of people in large churches, interfaith dialogues of understanding, etc. And it was not something that was happening just in the United States, all over the world. But what have these dialogues given us? Have they provided us with a better understanding of each other? Today, nearly 25 of the 50 states of the United States are in various stages of passing laws to ban the Islamic Sharia, which is so perplexing at many levels. There are less than, according to Pew studies, less than 1% of this country's population is Muslim. And 70% of Americans are Christians. This country, which is so predominantly Christian, cannot pass two laws of the Christian Sharia, which is abortion and banning gay marriages, in spite of practically controlling one political party, 50% of the political parties in this country having so much of resources, etc. So if 70% of this population can't pass two elements of the Christian Sharia, how are Muslims, who are less than 1% of this country, going to pass Sharia laws, that all the Sharia laws, and enforce them on the rest of the America? It's completely absurd. I find it meaningless. Even in countries where Muslims are in power, one of the good things that happened after the Arab Spring was the theoretical triumph of democracy. Everybody wanted democracy. There was no other means or alternative forms of government that Muslims sought, whether it was Tunisia, Libya, or Egypt. But even in these countries where Muslims are 90% or nearly 99% in Tunisia, they are not imposing the Sharia. I don't know how they're going to impose it in North Carolina. Now, what it really tells me is that there is hardly any understanding of Islam or Muslims or what the Sharia is in this country. So what has been the benefit of all these dialogues that we have had in the last 10, 12 years, and literally hundreds of millions of dollars spent on enormous projects, both by government and civil societies, for educating people, etc. That's the most depressing part to me personally, that after all this, is this all that we have achieved? But there is more to it. And more to it is, speaking from a mystical perspective, is that both the United States and the Muslim world have become spiritually sick in the legacy of September 11. The Sufis talk about sicknesses of the heart, jealousy, anger, envy, frustration, anxiety. These are all sicknesses of the heart. And when I look at the spread of Islamophobia in the US, and especially in Europe too, in Europe there are 4 minarets, and they had a referendum to pass the law banning minarets. In Switzerland, I find that fascinating that they are threatened by a minaret. That fear is a reflection of the sickness of the soul of the society. That the prejudice has become so deep that it is now being legislated as laws. It's manifestly against the constitution of most democratic society, but we still pass them because that sickness of prejudice that we are suffering from demands this. So the United States has become a victim of the prejudice, which is Islamophobia, and its attendant sicknesses, which we will see in other forms. It will exacerbate racism and other forms of intolerance in this country. But what is also interesting is if you look at the Muslim world, you see the same thing. When the Muslim world was not just anti-Western, but now you see that it's suffering from sectarianism. And what started as the Arab Spring, the search for democracy and dignity, has now ended up becoming a sectarian conflict between the Shia and the Sunni, and you see that in Syria and in events in Afghanistan, etc. So the legacy of September 11, both domestic and global, is certainly not positive in many, many ways. It's challenging. If you look closely, yes, you can see beacons of light here and there. The repeated election of President Obama, I see as something very positive. In the United States, the diminishing of prejudice against gay marriage is another positive thing that has happened in the United States. But you really have to search the horizon in search of positive things. Decline of education, decline of education systems, decline of legal systems, decline of respect and understanding of the Constitution and its values, etc., are overarching in the United States. And as far as the Muslim world is concerned, I think the main things that I saw positive was that at least when Muslims have an opportunity to aspire for change, they are aspiring for democracy, and there is widespread realization that there are problems that need to be addressed. Thank you very much.